The price of love. Isabella Munro knew that fairy tales were lies, but she never imagined her
तुम
life
रो
would
क्यों
become a
नहीं रही?
nightmare dressed in silk and diamonds. At 22 years old, her world had been simple and beautiful. She lived on a small farm with her
मैं जा रहा
parents,
हूं।
where morning dew kissed the grass and the scent of fresh bread filled their modest kitchen. Her father, Thomas, worked the land with honest hands. Her mother, Rebecca, tended their vegetable garden and sang old songs while cooking. Isabella dreamed of a simple love, perhaps with Daniel, the sweet boy from the neighboring farm who always smiled when she walked by. But dreams can shatter like glass dropped on stone. The troubles started quietly, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Her father's crops failed 2 seasons in a row. Medical bills piled up when her mother fell ill. Thomas, desperate and proud, signed papers he barely understood, taking loans from people who wore expensive suits and colder smiles. The debt grew like poison ivy, wrapping around everything they owned until one autumn morning when men in dark cars arrived at their door. The devil's bargain. The name Christopher Blackwell meant nothing to Isabella until it meant everything. He was a legend in the business world, a self-made billionaire at 34 who controlled half the real estate in the state. Magazines called him a genius. His employees called him ruthless. Women called him untouchable, a man carved from ice who attended galas with beautiful companions but never let anyone close to his heart. Christopher had purchased her father's debt from the bank. Not because he needed the money or wanted their tiny farm. He wanted something else entirely. He wanted Isabella. Thomas had thrown the papers across the room when Christopher's lawyer first explained the offer. "My daughter is not for sale," he had roared, his face red with fury and shame. But Rebecca, with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, had shown him the reality. Without this deal, they would lose everything. The farm that had belonged to Thomas's grandfather would be seized. They would be homeless, and Thomas, whose heart was already weak from stress, might not survive the blow. Isabella made her decision that night, sitting on the porch where she had spent countless peaceful evenings. She would sacrifice her happiness, her dreams, her freedom to save the people who had given her everything. When she told her parents, her voice was steady even as her heart broke into 1,000 pieces. "I will marry him, Papa. I will do this for us." A wedding without joy. 3 weeks later, Isabella stood in a cathedral that could hold 500 people. The dress she wore cost more than her family's farm, an ivory creation of lace and pearls that felt like a beautiful prison. Every step down the aisle felt like walking through deep snow, heavy and cold. The guests were strangers, wealthy people who whispered behind gloved hands about the country girl who had somehow captured Christopher Blackwell's attention. Christopher waited at the altar in a black suit that probably cost more than a car. He was devastatingly handsome in a harsh way, with sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes the color of a winter storm. He watched her approach with the same expression he might wear while reviewing a boring contract. There was no warmth, no tenderness, nothing but cold assessment. The ceremony passed like a blur of meaningless words. When the priest said, "You may kiss the bride," Christopher leaned in and pressed his lips to hers for exactly 2 seconds. It was not a kiss. It was a stamp of ownership, cold and perfunctory. Isabella felt her stomach turn. The reception was torture. Hundreds of people she had never met smiled fake smiles and offered hollow congratulations. She sat beside Christopher at the head table, a decoration beside a king, while he talked business with his associates and completely ignored her existence. She might as well have been invisible. The night of truth. When the ordeal finally ended, a driver took them to the most expensive hotel in the city. The presidential suite was larger than her entire childhood home. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed the glittering city below, a universe of lights that felt alien and cold. Christopher entered first, immediately pouring himself a drink from a crystal decanter. He downed it in one swallow, then turned to look at her. For the first time since the ceremony, he really looked at her. His gray eyes traveled from her face down to her feet and back up again. But there was no desire in that gaze, no appreciation. Only cold evaluation, like she was livestock he had purchased at market. "Take off the dress," he said. His voice was low and empty of emotion. Isabella's hands trembled as she reached for the zipper. A tiny, foolish part of her heart had hoped that maybe, in private, he would be different. That maybe behind the cold exterior was a man who could be kind. But when the expensive wedding gown fell to the floor and she stood vulnerable in her delicate wedding lingerie, that hope died. Christopher's expression hardened even more. His eyes filled with something that made her blood freeze. It was disgust. Pure, undisguised disgust. He took a step toward her, and she instinctively stepped back. He stopped, and a cruel smile twisted his lips. Words like knives. "Look at you," he said, his voice soft but filled with venom. "Bought and paid for. A sacrifice offered up to save your failing family. Tell me, Isabella, how does it feel to sell yourself? What price did your father put on your dignity?" Tears burned in Isabella's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She straightened her spine, lifting her chin. "My dignity is not for sale," she whispered, though her voice shook. Christopher laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Of course it is. You just sold it. But let me make something very clear to you right now." He stepped closer, invading her space, his face inches from hers but still not touching her. "You are not my wife. You are a contract. You are insurance that your father will never bother me again. You are a ghost who will live in my house to keep up appearances." His gaze dropped to her body again, and for just a moment, something dark and hungry flashed in his eyes. Something primal that made her breath catch. But it vanished instantly, replaced by cold indifference. "I will never touch you," he hissed, each word a blade. "The thought of having you in my bed, of touching a woman who would sell herself, disgusts me." The pain that shot through Isabella was physical. It felt like he had actually stabbed her in the chest. She had given up everything for this. Her home, her freedom, her dreams. And for what? To be despised and humiliated? Christopher turned away from her as if her presence bored him. He walked to the enormous bed and began removing his shoes. "Sleep on the floor," he commanded without looking at her. "That is where you belong. Near the door in case I need something. And do not cry. The sound of your self-pity irritates me." He removed his jacket and tie, climbed into the bed, and turned his back to her. Within minutes, his breathing became deep and regular. He had fallen asleep as if nothing had happened, as if he had not just destroyed another human being with his words. Isabella stood frozen in the middle of the luxury suite, shivering despite the warm room. She looked at the man in the bed, the stranger who was now her husband and her jailer. She looked at the cold marble floor. The wedding dress lay in a crumpled heap at her feet like a fallen angel. Finally, the tears she had been holding back fell silently down her cheeks. She found a thin throw blanket on the sofa and curled up on the floor near the door, as far from him as possible. The marble was cold and hard beneath her. She cried quietly, mourning everything she had lost, her home, her freedom, her dreams of simple love, and the innocent girl she had been just that morning. In that moment, lying on the floor of a golden cage, Isabella Munro understood that her marriage was not a union. It was a prison sentence. And the man sleeping peacefully in that bed was not her husband. He was her enemy. A war had begun, silent and lonely. And she did not know if she would survive it, the mansion of shadows. The first morning in Christopher Blackwell's mansion, Isabella woke with her entire body aching from sleeping on the hard floor. Sunlight streamed through the massive windows, but it brought no warmth to her heart. Christopher was already gone, his side of the bed perfectly made as if no one had slept there. She would learn this was his pattern: leave before dawn, return after midnight, and pretend she did not exist. The mansion was a monument to wealth and loneliness. It had 30 rooms spread across 3 floors, with marble staircases, crystal chandeliers, and artwork that probably cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. But it felt empty, like a beautiful mausoleum. The staff, led by a stern housekeeper named Margaret, treated Isabella with cold politeness. They called her Mrs. Blackwell, but their eyes held pity mixed with curiosity. They had seen other women come and go from Christopher's life, but never a wife. Isabella was given her own bedroom in the east wing, far from Christopher's master suite. It was decorated in soft creams and golds, with a 4-poster bed draped in silk and a balcony overlooking the gardens. It was beautiful and suffocating. She spent the first few days wandering the empty halls like a ghost, trying to understand her new prison. The only kindness came from an elderly groundskeeper named George. He had worked for the Blackwell family for 40 years and remembered when the mansion had been filled with laughter. Mr. Christopher was not always like this, George told her one afternoon as she explored the gardens. He was a different man before she broke him. Isabella wanted to ask who she was, but George had already turned away, returning to his roses. Thunder and freedom. On her 5th day in the mansion, Isabella discovered the stables. They sat at the far edge of the property, half hidden by overgrown trees. Most of the stalls were empty and dusty, abandoned years ago. But in the last stall, she found him, a magnificent black stallion with wild eyes and a spirit that had not been broken. "That is Thunder," George said, appearing behind her. He belonged to Mr. Christopher's father. No one has been able to ride him since the old man died 5 years ago. The horse is too wild, too angry. Mr. Christopher keeps him because he cannot bear to sell his father's favorite, but no one can get near him. Isabella looked into Thunder's dark eyes and saw herself reflected there. A creature trapped, angry, desperate for freedom. She spent that entire afternoon sitting outside his stall, not trying to touch him, just talking softly about her own life. About the farm she had left behind, about her family, about the prison she now lived in. Every day after that, she returned. She brought apples from the kitchen, carrots from George's garden. Thunder would snort and stamp at first, tossing his magnificent head. But Isabella was patient. She understood pain and fear because she lived with them every day. Slowly, over weeks, the horse began to trust her. First, he would eat from her hand. Then he let her touch his neck. Finally, one golden afternoon, he allowed her to put a bridle on him. George watched from a distance, shaking his head in amazement. "You have a gift, Mrs. Blackwell," he said. "That horse has not let anyone near him in years." For the first time since her wedding night, Isabella smiled. It was a small victory, but it was hers. The confrontation. Christopher Blackwell prided himself on control. He controlled his emotions, his business empire, and everyone around him. But lately, something had been disturbing his carefully ordered world. His wife. The woman he had bought and humiliated. The ghost he had ordered to stay invisible. Margaret had mentioned that Isabella spent hours at the old stables. Christopher told himself he did not care what the country girl did with her time. But one evening, curiosity got the better of him. Or perhaps it was something else, something he refused to name. He walked to the stables just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. What he saw made him stop in his tracks. Isabella stood in the center of the corral with Thunder. She was not wearing any of the expensive designer clothes his assistant had purchased for her. Instead, she wore simple riding pants and a white cotton shirt, her long dark hair in a braid down her back. She looked natural, alive, real in a way that made something twist in Christopher's chest. Thunder, the horse that had thrown 3 professional trainers and bitten a stable hand, was eating an apple from her hand like a gentle pet. She was talking to him in that soft voice of hers, and the horse was actually listening, his ears pricked forward with attention. The late afternoon sun caught her profile, highlighting the curve of her cheek, the graceful line of her neck. She laughed at something the horse did, and the sound carried across the yard. It was genuine joy, something Christopher had not heard in his mansion for years. For just a moment, he did not see the woman he had bought to settle a debt. He saw someone strong, patient, and remarkably beautiful. Not the artificial beauty of the socialites who threw themselves at him, but something raw and natural that made his heart beat faster. The feeling disturbed him. He clenched his jaw and turned away sharply. It was a trick, he told himself. She was trying to make him feel something, to manipulate him. Everything about her was false. Dinner and defiance. That evening, Margaret insisted they have dinner together. "It looks wrong, sir," she said firmly. "A newly married couple who never share a meal. People are starting to talk." So Christopher found himself sitting at one end of the long dining table while Isabella sat at the other end, an ocean of polished wood between them. She barely touched her food, her eyes downcast. The silence was thick enough to cut. "I hear you have been playing with thunder," Christopher said suddenly. His voice cut through the quiet like a knife. Isabella looked up, surprised that he was speaking to her. She nodded carefully. "He is a beautiful horse." "He is a dangerous animal," Christopher replied coldly. "I do not want you near him anymore. If you get hurt, it would be inconvenient for me." The injustice of his words hit Isabella like a slap. Thunder was the only thing in this entire mansion that brought her any comfort, any joy. And now he wanted to take that away too? Something inside her snapped. The quiet, obedient girl who had accepted humiliation without fighting back suddenly found her voice. "I will not get hurt," she said, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since their wedding night. "I know what I am doing. I grew up around horses." Christopher raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement crossing his face. "Ah yes, I forgot about your humble origins. But this is not your dirty little farm, Isabella. This is my property. You are my property. You will do as I say. And if I do not?" The words came out before she could stop them. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she held his gaze. The amusement vanished from Christopher's face, replaced by something darker. He set down his silverware with deliberate slowness and leaned back in his chair, studying her like a predator studying prey. "Then I will remind you of your place here," he said softly, dangerously. "There are many ways to make someone's life unpleasant, wife. Do not tempt me to explore them." He stood abruptly, threw his napkin on the table, and walked out of the dining room without another word. Isabella sat alone in the enormous room, her hands shaking but her head held high. She had stood up to him. For the first time, she had refused to be invisible. The war between them had found its voice. The business dinner. 2 weeks later, Christopher announced that he was hosting an important business dinner at the mansion. His assistant, a sharp woman named Patricia, delivered the message. "You will act as hostess. Smile, be polite, and do not embarrass Mr. Blackwell. Your only job is to look beautiful and stay quiet." Isabella spent the entire day preparing. Not because she wanted to please Christopher, but because she refused to humiliate herself in front of strangers. She wore a deep emerald gown that hugged her curves, her hair styled in an elegant updo that left a few soft curls framing her face. When she descended the staircase that evening, Christopher was waiting in the foyer with several of his business associates. He was in the middle of a sentence when he looked up and saw her. He stopped talking mid-word. His gray eyes widened almost imperceptibly, traveling from her face down to her feet and back up again. For 3 full seconds, his mask of indifference cracked. Isabella saw surprise flash across his features, followed by something that looked almost like appreciation before he quickly hid it behind his usual cold expression. "Good evening," Isabella said quietly, her voice calm despite her racing heart. The guests, wealthy businessmen and their elegant wives, looked at her with open curiosity. Christopher's mysterious new wife had been the subject of much gossip in their circles. Isabella greeted each guest with natural grace, making them feel welcome in a way that surprised even Christopher. She did not talk much, as instructed, but when she did speak, her words were thoughtful. She had a gift for making people feel heard and valued, something she had learned from her mother. Halfway through dinner, an elderly businessman named Mr. Harrison turned to her. "Mrs. Blackwell, your husband tells us you grew up on a farm. That must have been quite different from this life." Before Christopher could redirect the conversation, Isabella smiled. "Very different, Mr. Harrison. But I learned valuable things there. Hard work, patience, and that the most beautiful things in life are often the simplest." Several guests nodded approvingly. Mr. Harrison's wife reached over and patted Isabella's hand. "What a refreshing perspective, my dear." Christopher watched this interaction with an unreadable expression. His wife, the woman he had tried so hard to break and ignore, was charming his most important business contacts with genuine warmth. The rival appears. Just as dessert was being served, the doorbell rang. Margaret appeared in the dining room doorway looking flustered. "Sir, Miss Sterling is here. She says you invited her." Christopher's jaw tightened. "I did not." But it was too late. Victoria Sterling swept into the dining room like she owned it. She was stunning in a red dress that left little to the imagination, with platinum blonde hair and the kind of beauty that came from expensive surgeons and personal trainers. She had been Christopher's companion at social events for years, though everyone knew theirs was an arrangement of convenience, not love. "Christopher, darling," Victoria purred, completely ignoring Isabella. "I heard you were having a dinner party and I could not miss it." Her eyes finally landed on Isabella, and they turned cold. "Oh. You must be the new wife. How quaint." The insult was clear. Isabella felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she kept her composure. "Good evening, Miss Sterling. Would you like to join us?" Victoria laughed, a brittle sound. "How sweet. The farm girl knows manners." She turned to Christopher. "Darling, we need to discuss the charity gala next month. You will escort me, as usual?" Christopher's eyes flicked to Isabella, then back to Victoria. "That will not be appropriate now." Victoria's smile turned sharp. "Oh, but surely your little wife understands that business relationships must be maintained. She seems like the understanding type." The room had gone silent, everyone watching the drama unfold. Isabella felt every eye on her, waiting to see if she would crumble. Her hands clenched in her lap under the table. This woman was trying to humiliate her in front of everyone, to remind her that she was an outsider who did not belong in Christopher's world. But Isabella had survived worse. She had survived sleeping on the floor of her wedding suite. She had survived weeks of being treated like a ghost. She would survive this too. She looked directly at Victoria, her voice calm and clear. "I understand perfectly, Miss Sterling. I understand that some people try to hold on to things that were never really theirs to begin with. But the past is the past. Christopher and I are building a future together." It was not entirely true, but Victoria did not need to know that. The blonde woman's eyes narrowed dangerously. But before she could respond, Christopher spoke. "Isabella is correct. Victoria, you should leave." Everyone at the table looked shocked, including Isabella. Victoria's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. "Christopher, you cannot be serious." "I am always serious. Good night, Victoria." The woman stood there for a long moment, fury radiating from her. Then she spun on her expensive heels and stormed out of the mansion. After she left, the dinner continued, but the atmosphere had changed. Several guests looked at Isabella with new respect. She had stood her ground against Victoria Sterling, something few people dared to do. When the last guest finally left and Isabella was alone in her room, she allowed herself to shake. She had won a small battle tonight, but the war was far from over. And Christopher Blackwell, watching from his study window as the last car drove away, could not stop thinking about the way his wife had looked in that green dress, or the strength in her voice when she had faced down Victoria. Something was changing, something he could not control. And it terrified him more than any business deal ever had, the charity gala. 3 weeks after the dinner party incident, Isabella received an invitation to the annual Blackwell Foundation Charity Gala. It was the most prestigious social event of the season, and Christopher was the host. Patricia delivered a message along with the invitation. Mr. Blackwell expects you to attend. Wear something appropriate. Do not embarrass him. Isabella knew this was a test. Victoria Sterling would certainly be there, along with every influential person in the city. They would all be watching the farm girl who had somehow married Christopher Blackwell, waiting for her to stumble and prove she did not belong. She spent days preparing, not out of fear but out of determination. If Christopher wanted her to play the role of his wife in public, she would do it with dignity. She chose a gown of midnight blue silk that flowed like water, with delicate silver embroidery that caught the light. Her dark hair was swept up elegantly, with a few loose curls softening her face. She wore the diamond necklace that had been delivered to her room that morning, clearly chosen by Patricia, not Christopher. When the limousine arrived to take them to the hotel ballroom, Christopher was already inside. He looked devastatingly handsome in his black tuxedo, his dark hair perfectly styled, his gray eyes as cold as ever. He barely glanced at her as she slid into the seat beside him. "Remember," he said without looking at her, "smile, be gracious, and stay out of my way. This event is important for business. I do not need you creating problems." Isabella did not respond. She simply looked out the window at the city lights passing by, her hands folded calmly in her lap. The Lion's Den. The ballroom was magnificent, filled with crystal chandeliers, white roses, and hundreds of guests in expensive clothes. An orchestra played soft music while waiters circulated with champagne and appetizers. Isabella felt every eye turn toward them as they entered. Christopher immediately placed his hand on the small of her back, a gesture that looked affectionate but felt possessive. He guided her through the crowd, introducing her to business associates and wealthy donors. Isabella played her part perfectly, smiling warmly and making polite conversation. She discovered she had a natural ability to remember names and details, something that clearly surprised Christopher when she asked a CEO's wife about her daughter's recent graduation. But trouble was waiting. Victoria Sterling arrived fashionably late, wearing a stunning red gown that plunged daringly low. She was accompanied by several of her wealthy friends, all beautiful women who looked at Isabella like predators sizing up prey. "Christopher!" Victoria called out, sweeping toward them with her entourage. "What a wonderful event! And Isabella, how brave of you to attend. These galas can be so overwhelming for someone not used to high society." The insult was wrapped in false sweetness. Isabella smiled politely. "I am managing quite well, thank you, Victoria." "Of course you are, dear," Victoria continued, her voice dripping with condescension. "Though I must say, that dress is lovely. Very understated. Smart choice for someone trying not to draw too much attention to themselves." One of Victoria's friends, a woman named Cassandra, laughed behind her hand. "Victoria, you are terrible. But honestly, Mrs. Blackwell, we are all dying to know. What is it like going from milking cows to attending galas? It must be quite the adjustment." The small group of women laughed. Several nearby guests had stopped their conversations to watch. Isabella felt heat creep up her neck, but she kept her composure. She had dealt with mean girls before, though never ones wearing designer gowns and diamond earrings. "Actually," Isabella said clearly, "growing up on a farm taught me more about real value than any amount of money could. I learned about hard work, honesty, and treating people with respect regardless of their background. Those lessons seem more valuable than ever in a room like this." The laughter stopped. Several people nearby nodded approvingly. Victoria's smile became strained. "How charming," Victoria said, her voice sharp now. "Christopher, darling, we really must discuss the Foundation's new project. Perhaps we could talk privately? I am sure your wife would not mind." Before Christopher could respond, Victoria linked her arm through his and began pulling him away. Isabella watched them go, feeling a strange pang in her chest. Christopher went with Victoria without even glancing back at her, leaving Isabella standing alone in the middle of the ballroom. Standing alone. For a moment, Isabella wanted to run. To flee this world of fake smiles and cruel games. But then she remembered sleeping on the floor of her wedding suite. She remembered her father's tears when she agreed to marry Christopher. She had survived worse than Victoria Sterling's petty cruelty. She held her head high and walked to the bar, ordering a glass of water. An older gentleman approached her, someone she had met earlier. It was Mr. Harrison from the dinner party. "Mrs. Blackwell," he said kindly, "I could not help but overhear that exchange. You handled it with remarkable grace." "Thank you, Mr. Harrison," Isabella said, grateful for his kindness. "My late wife came from humble beginnings too," he continued. "She faced the same cruelty from women like Miss Sterling. But she taught me that true class has nothing to do with money. It comes from here." He tapped his chest over his heart. "You have it, my dear. Do not let anyone make you forget that." His words brought tears to Isabella's eyes, but she blinked them back. "That means more than you know." Across the room, Christopher stood with Victoria, but he was not paying attention to anything she said. His eyes kept finding Isabella, watching her talk with Mr. Harrison, seeing the way she held herself with quiet dignity despite being abandoned in a room full of strangers. Something uncomfortable twisted in his chest. The revelation. The attack came during dinner. Victoria had arranged the seating so she was next to Christopher, with Isabella placed several seats away. As the main course was served, Victoria stood up, tapping her champagne glass for attention. "Everyone, if I could have your attention please," she announced. "I would like to make a toast to our generous host, Christopher Blackwell, and to share a little story." Christopher's eyes narrowed. He had a bad feeling about this. Victoria smiled sweetly. "Many of you have wondered about Christopher's sudden marriage. Well, I did some research, and I discovered the most fascinating story. It seems Isabella's family was deeply in debt. Her father owed Christopher's bank a considerable amount of money. And our dear Christopher, always the businessman, made quite the bargain. He would forgive the debt in exchange for marriage to the daughter. So romantic, is it not? A modern-day business transaction dressed up as a wedding." Gasps rippled through the room. Everyone turned to look at Isabella, whose face had gone pale. The truth was out, exposed for everyone to see. She was not Christopher's chosen bride. She was a debt payment, a purchased commodity. Victoria continued, enjoying the drama. "So when you see them together, remember that this is not a love story. It is a business deal. She sold herself to save her family's farm. One has to wonder what that makes her." The implication was clear and cruel. Several women whispered to each other, looking at Isabella with a mixture of pity and disdain. Christopher stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. His face was dark with fury, but not at Isabella. At Victoria. "That is enough," he said, his voice cutting through the whispers like ice. But Isabella stood too. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. She looked directly at Victoria, then at the hundreds of guests watching her humiliation. "You are absolutely right, Miss Sterling," Isabella said clearly. "I did marry Christopher to save my family. And yes, it was a business arrangement. But let me tell you what that means." She took a breath, feeling every eye on her. "It means I was willing to sacrifice my own happiness for the people I love. It means I understood that sometimes life requires us to make difficult choices, choices that others might judge but cannot truly understand. My father worked his entire life on that farm. He raised me to value family above all else. When he needed help, I gave it the only way I could. Isabella's voice grew stronger. You can mock me for coming from a farm. You can laugh at my simple background. But I am not ashamed of where I came from or what I did. I saved my family's home. I protected my parents from losing everything. And if that makes me someone you look down upon, then I am proud to be someone you will never understand. The room had gone completely silent. Even Victoria looked stunned. Isabella turned to look at Christopher, meeting his gray eyes directly. I may have been bought, Mr. Blackwell. But I have never been broken. And I never will be. Then she walked out of the ballroom with her head held high, leaving behind a room full of shocked guests and a husband who stood frozen, watching her go. The truth comes out. Christopher found her in the garden behind the hotel, sitting on a stone bench beneath the stars. She had removed her high heels and was holding them in her lap, staring up at the night sky like she was searching for answers. He approached slowly, unsure of what to say. For the first time in years, Christopher Blackwell felt something he had not experienced since he was young. He felt ashamed. That was remarkably brave, he said quietly. Isabella did not look at him. I just told the truth. Something people in your world seem afraid to do. He sat down on the bench, keeping distance between them. Victoria had no right to humiliate you like that. She had every right, Isabella replied. She told the truth. I am exactly what she said I am. A woman who sold herself for money. That is not what you are. Now she looked at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Then what am I, Christopher? Tell me. Because from where I sit, I am a ghost in your house. A decoration you bought to keep up appearances. You made it very clear on our wedding night what you think of me. Christopher was quiet for a long moment. Then, to Isabella's complete surprise, he spoke. 6 years ago, I was engaged to a woman named Caroline. She was beautiful, intelligent, from a good family. I loved her more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. We were 2 weeks away from our wedding when I discovered the truth. She had only been with me for my money. She was having an affair with my business partner, planning to marry me and then divorce me for half of everything I owned. I caught them together in my own home. Isabella's breath caught. She had not expected this, had not expected him to share anything real with her. It destroyed me, Christopher continued, his voice raw in a way she had never heard before. I built walls around my heart so high that nothing could get through. I swore I would never let anyone close enough to hurt me again. Every woman who approached me after that, I knew they only wanted my money. I became what you see now. Cold. Suspicious. Cruel. He turned to look at her, and in the moonlight, she could see something in his eyes she had never seen before. Vulnerability. When your father's debt came across my desk, I saw an opportunity. A business arrangement. A marriage without love, without risk, without the possibility of being hurt again. I thought I could have a wife for appearances without giving anything of myself. I thought I could control everything. And now? Isabella whispered. Now I realize I was wrong. Christopher's voice was barely audible. These past weeks, watching you tame thunder, seeing you stand up to me at dinner, watching you win over Mr. Harrison and handle Victoria with grace. You are nothing like what I expected. Nothing like Caroline. You are real, Isabella. Real in a way no one in my life has been for years. Tears slipped down Isabella's cheeks. You have been so cruel to me. I know. He looked away, shame clear on his face. I was punishing you for Caroline's sins. I was trying to break you before you could break me. But you refused to break. You are stronger than I ever gave you credit for. What are you saying? Isabella's heart was pounding. Christopher stood up, running his hand through his hair in frustration. I am saying that I do not know how to do this. I do not know how to let anyone in. But when Victoria was humiliating you in there, I wanted to destroy her. When I saw you walk out, I felt something I have not felt in 6 years. I felt like I was losing something precious. He turned back to her, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. It was not cold anymore. There was fire there, burning beneath the ice. I do not know if I can be the man you deserve, he said. But I would like to try. If you will let me. The beginning of something new. Isabella stood up slowly, her heart racing. She looked at this man who had caused her so much pain, but who was now standing before her, vulnerable for the first time. She thought about walking away, about demanding he let her go back to her family. But she also thought about Thunder, about how patience and kindness had tamed a wild heart. I will not be treated like a ghost anymore, she said firmly. I will not sleep on floors or be ignored. If you want to try, then really try. No more cruelty. No more pretending I do not exist. Agreed, Christopher said immediately. And you have to let me keep riding Thunder. A small smile touched his lips, the first real smile she had ever seen from him. He is yours. I think he always was. They stood there in the garden, with the sounds of the gala drifting out from the ballroom behind them. Slowly, carefully, Christopher reached out and took her hand. It was the first time he had touched her with gentleness, and Isabella felt warmth spread through her at the contact. I cannot promise this will be easy, he said. I have been cold for so long, I do not know if I remember how to be anything else. Then we will learn together, Isabella replied. He pulled her closer, and this time when he looked at her, there was no disgust or indifference in his eyes. There was wonder and desire and something that looked almost like fear. The fear of letting someone in, of being vulnerable again. Isabella, he whispered her name like a prayer. Yes? May I kiss you? Really kiss you this time? Her answer was to rise on her toes and press her lips to his. The kiss was nothing like the cold brush of lips at their wedding. It was fire and passion, weeks of tension and pain and longing exploding between them. Christopher's arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her against him as if he was afraid she might disappear. Isabella's hands slid up to his shoulders, then into his hair. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. Christopher rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. I do not deserve you, he murmured. No, Isabella agreed softly. But maybe you can earn me. He laughed, a genuine sound of joy that she had never heard from him before. I will spend the rest of my life trying. From that night forward, everything changed. Christopher came home for dinner every evening. He asked about her day, about Thunder, about the books she was reading. Slowly, carefully, they began to build something real between them. He showed her his business, explaining deals and strategies, and discovered she had a sharp mind for numbers. She showed him the gardens, teaching him the names of flowers and the joy of simple things. Victoria Sterling tried several more times to cause trouble, spreading rumors and making scenes. But Christopher shut her down publicly, making it clear that Isabella was his wife in every sense of the word. Eventually, Victoria moved on to other targets, defeated. 6 months after that charity gala, Isabella woke up in the master bedroom, not in the guest room. She was wrapped in Christopher's arms, the morning sun streaming through the windows. He was still asleep, his face peaceful in a way she had never seen before. The walls around his heart had not come down easily, but they had come down. She thought about the girl who had walked down the aisle in terror, who had slept on the floor of her wedding suite. She thought about all the pain and humiliation she had endured. And she realized that sometimes the hardest battles lead to the greatest victories. Christopher stirred, opening his gray eyes to look at her. But they were not cold anymore. They were warm, filled with love he no longer tried to hide. "Good morning, my wife," he said softly, pulling her closer. "Good morning, my husband," she replied, and this time, the words felt real. Their story had not started with love. It had started with cruelty and pain, with a transaction and a cage of gold. But it had become something beautiful. Something worth fighting for. And as Christopher kissed her softly, Isabella knew that they had both been broken before they met. But together, they had learned how to heal. The millionaire's brutal words on their wedding night had nearly destroyed her. But in the end, they had led her to something she never expected. They had led her to real love, hard-won and all the more precious because of it. And in the stables, Thunder galloped free, finally at peace just like his mistress. The end.